Hey guys, welcome to the demo video for the new city brush set that I just released. It is in my Gumroad store now. You can find a link in the description of this video, and it is free. You can type in 0 to download it for free, or if you want to leave a tip or a contribution, I super appreciate anyone who does, but again, it's not necessary. I want everyone to be able to use this. So because I want this video to be focused more on painting and not be a drawing video, I decided that I would start with a SketchUp model rather than doing a perspective drawing. Mainly because I didn't want to do a perspective drawing and then have it be confusing for someone who, isn't familiar with perspective. I will do a, full perspective drawing tutorial soon, actually. I want to do another demo that involves starting with a perspective drawing, but I thought it'd be fun to start with some basic building blocks in SketchUp. And this is a really easy and accessible way that anyone can create a lay-in for a city. So if you want to make your own, you totally can. SketchUp is a free software by Trimble. There's a free web version that's what I'm using here right now. There's lots of tutorials on YouTube for how to use SketchUp, but the tools that I used to block in this are very simple. I pretty much just dragged squares on the ground and then brought them up in space, and then I turned this one a little bit so that we could have a building that was not exactly in line with the other ones, and then I used the curve tool to create a curve for this building here. So I pretty much just made a square and then used the curve tool to create a curved front and brought that up. But like I said, there's lots of tutorials on how to use SketchUp on YouTube. That's how I learned. Super easy, super fun software. So I mocked up this little scene, and after mocking it up, I just went export, and I exported it as a PNG. You can also just screenshot it. Either way works. I recommend after you bring any sort of 3D model into Photoshop or your drawing software, I highly recommend overlaying a perspective grid on top of it, so that you can have something to line your details up with besides just the edges of the buildings. So when I jump into the footage, you'll see the sketch has some perspective lines on top of it. I used the perspective tools too, which you can find on Gumroad. I'll link that in the description also. It's a really, really amazing plugin for Photoshop. But Clip Studio Paint and Procreate also just kind of have perspective tools built in. But yeah, I used the perspective tools to overlay perspective and get going so that we could jump right into paintings. Okay, I have got my sketch here. I'm going to set it to multiply in a group along with my perspective lines, and then I'm going to start painting underneath. I tried to leave enough space to show like a lot of different types of brushes in here, and a lot of different ways that we can use them. So I've got like the far distance, some like middle ground, and then also like a curved building. So we'll look at how to warp windows into a curved building and all kinds of fun stuff. But first we got to lay in the far background. So I have laid in my mountains, and now next I'm going to use my like kind of distant noise brushes to brush on the appearance of distant city texture. So this is how I'm kind of imagining these will be used. You notice to imply that there's buildings, there's stuff going on back there, like we don't need to add a ton of detail. We don't want to spend a bunch of time rendering it or anything. We just want to get the feeling of there being city noise in the distance. And then next, I'm using the distant light brushes to add some glowing little lights. I know that I want this to be kind of an evening piece, so we can get some pretty, lights glowing in kind of a late evening atmosphere. So I am using a variety of different distant light and distant building brushes to create the appearance of buildings receding off into the distance. I used one of the cube brushes, the one with rounded corners, to drop in some kind of nearer buildings, and then used one of the far buildings light brushes to drop some windows right on top of that. Next, I'm using the lasso tool to draw in or to fill in the kind of next layer forward. So I'm working from back to front here, and now that I've done the far background, I have to do kind of the back part of the midground. I used the polygonal lasso tool to select the hard edges of the buildings, And then I'm using a brush from the Kyle T. Webster Impressionist pack to brush on some kind of splotchy, grainy color variation into my bases, so that I'm starting from a point of there already being some noise established, which helps make buildings look a lot more realistic and like lived in my experience, than having them be just like one very solid digital color. I'm creating new layers for each one of these buildings. Sometimes a layer will have two buildings, but for the most part, it's one layer per building. If there's two buildings on a layer, it's because they're kind of spread apart from one another and on kind of the same plane, the same like visual plane. Speeding this up a little bit more, since it's just more of the same, using the lasso tool, blocking in my bases, and then I'm adding a little bit of light onto the buildings next. I'm already kind of thinking at this point about what I want my color scheme to be. I'm thinking that I want it to be kind of a lilac and yellow color scheme, so I'm trying to put in neutral versions of those colors for my bases, so I want my most saturated colors to be like a nice lilac and a nice yellow or orange. So I'm using kind of the muddy, more neutral versions of those colors to block in my bases for these buildings. And I want to get a feeling of depth and space even at this point. So I'm trying to, organize my colors in a way that feels pleasing. I'm concentrating the oranges kind of around the focal area in the center, and then having them go more neutral and cool as they move back in space. Thinking about maybe concentrating the light kind of around the mid front area to bring that forward, bring that toward us, and make it feel like a central part of the piece. So next, I am jumping into using the windows. So I'm playing around with a couple different options, just, drawing down, holding shift to draw a line of windows down, and then using transform distort, which is under edit. So you go up to edit and then transform distort to put them into perspective. So I'm going to repeat that process for every single building here. If you didn't catch it, don't worry. I'm going to show it in real time in just a minute. But first, since these ones are kind of more in the back, I'm just speeding through it. And then on that main building, I will show you guys in detail how we do this. But it's the same process every time. I'm choosing a set of windows. I'm holding shift to draw a straight stroke down with the brush, and then transforming those windows into space, into the perspective. That is the same process every single time I'm doing one of these buildings. And that is the way that I intended these brushes to be used. You can see here I cut away a piece of it too. You don't always need to use like the whole stroke. You can cut some windows away, use them. However, that's the idea, at least, is that they can be used in, a variety of ways. We can kind of cut little pieces of them here and there to use in whatever way is most effective. You can see here I'm trying to make sure that the windows line up to each other, at least mostly. Like, I'm not trying to get them perfect, but at least kind of look like they line up to each other. And then I'm cutting some of the windows that I have already painted and am using them for the upper area and just kind of stretching them out. Okay, I'm showing this in real time now so that you guys can really clearly see it. I grabbed one of those skyscraper brushes. I drew a stroke down holding shift to keep it straight. I went to edit, transform, distort, and now I'm using my perspective grid to transform it, to distort it into the perspective so that it sits, realistically on that window plane. And that is the same process that I did for the other buildings. It can be a little bit confusing at first if you're not super familiar with following a perspective grid, but if you go through it a few times, hopefully it will become clear and you'll kind of understand how it works, and you'll see how you can use this process quickly to add windows onto your buildings. So I cut away a section of the middle windows here just to create a more interesting pattern. I want this building to have some character, some personality. So that's always an option. We can cut away sections of windows and, kind of design our buildings however we want. Doing the same thing for the side of the building now, following that perspective grid, just putting those windows into perspective, making sure they sit at least fairly well on the side of this building. And you can see that I'm not super worried about getting it absolutely perfect. You know, if this was client work or if it was for a project that I, you know, needed it to be like really, really perfect, then I could. But I really wanted this demo to be almost more like a speed painting. Like, I think the total time on this video was an hour and 21 minutes. So, you know, this was like a quick, like just throwing some paint on there, getting the idea of a space kind of a deal, rather than, you know, a super accurate perspective, everything is perfect type of painting. And I kind of wanted to do this to show that we can use this. You know, one of the reasons I wanted to make this brush set was for more like loose work, you know, so that we can like really rapidly make some architectural city pieces that are fun and look nice, and also don't take forever. So you see I grabbed another window type there, made another kind of tower, and I'm putting that in the middle here. So, you know, adding multiple types of windows to one building is also something we can totally do, and I think it looks pretty cool and fun, bringing those ones up higher. Yeah, I'm just cutting out different pieces of the windows and using them in different places, just kind of trying to create a fun piece of architecture here. I think mixing and matching different window types can look really nice and also feel like believable and real. You know, it makes it feel more like a real place that, like, you know, an architect thought about the architecture and thought about what would look nice and pleasing in this space. So definitely you can mix and match them and come up with, you know, fun and interesting combinations. Since there's so many different types of window brushes, you know, there's probably like almost infinite amounts of combinations that you can use on buildings and generate a different looking building every time. I'm also thinking about how at the bottom of the building, you know, the first floor, usually there's a different appearance. You know, it's like lobbies. Well, it's not just the first floor. That would be the first couple floors. But, you know, maybe there's a different type of windows. Maybe these are conference rooms. It's it's a different type of space than the top, which might be like just offices or something. You know, thinking about what the building might be used for can really help. It can really help the realism and making it feel like a real lived-in space. Next, I am using some of the like blocky graphic looking window brushes to start brushing sky color onto these windows, and you know, some reflections onto them because it's not night yet. So we will see some of that, you know, light blue sky reflecting into the windows, and we'll see, you know, some little spots of lit windows coming through near the bottom or all over. But, you know, it's like a combination because the sky is still light. I really love this time of day for city architecture. We get such a fun combination of like reflections and lights, and it just looks really nice. But yeah, so I'm using, you know, some of the window brushes on top of other window brushes to create, you know, patterns of lights and darks throughout the windows, trying to really quickly generate patterns of lights and darks as we brush the window color onto the windows. That's something that I also was thinking about, you know, having brushes that could be used in different ways. So some of those like single window and square brushes can be used that way. Next here, I am going to be using Transform Warp, and you can see I am just pushing up those little lines at the top to warp this whole building around this round cylinder-ish shape, and then I'm pushing that forward to show that the perspective is turning over. Super fun, easy technique to create curving buildings. I wanted to add a curved building specifically to show that. So yeah, that's just found under Transform Warp. So I kind of distorted the edges into place first and then used warp to just bring up those curves, and it looks really realistic, doesn't it? Like I think it looks really cool. So I definitely wanted to show that. That's why I wanted to add that curved building in, because it just looks so fun. I really like how that comes out. Okay, super speeding through this next section because I don't want to bore you guys because it's just more of the same. It is more of grabbing different window brushes, creating strokes with them by holding shift and then using transform distort to put them into perspective. I'm just repeating that process over and over again with different window brushes for these buildings. You can see that I will grab, pieces of the windows here and there to do those, fun little architectural bits that we see sometimes, like the cut-ins and things like that. You'll see me cut off sections of the windows too, to use like two columns of windows instead of three, or whatever, just pretty much using them however makes sense in the moment. Just trying to get a nice variety so that these buildings all look different. They don't look like it's the same building over and over again. Sometimes I will try out multiple window brushes before deciding on one. And, once you go through the process a few times, it's pretty quick actually to distort the windows into perspective. It's not super time consuming. So I do feel like I can kind of play around and don't need to be too precious with it. That's why I really like this method. I totally recommend that as you're doing a city painting, find reference of all the different types of buildings that you're drawing. Draw a column of windows and see, what it looks like, and then go on Pinterest or Google and find some reference of buildings that have that type of windows, because it might give you some ideas about what type of architecture you want to create for it, because, while I was making these different types of windows, I was looking at a lot of reference of different types of skyscrapers, and I learn a lot about different buildings and the architectural elements on each one from making them. I definitely recommend exploring reference as you paint and learning about the different types of buildings. There's lots of stuff that we can learn just from looking and kind of thinking, really looking at our reference and trying to engage with it. So not just copying it, but thinking about like why things have the shape that they do. Why are these windows shaped this way? Why is this building, why does this building look this way? What purpose does this building serve? Who's using this building? What kind of places would this building exist in? Those sort of elements can help us create locations that feel real, I'm thinking here that this is like maybe some sort of, office conference center in the curved building with other office buildings around it, some kind of complex. There's like a parking lot down at the bottom there. I'm just trying to think about like what sort of people would be here, and what would they be using the space for, because that can help us figure out, for example, what sort of lights would be on, who is in this space. Why are these lights on in this building and not here? And that can help us lead us towards storytelling as we create these spaces. So I'm using just kind of blocky square brushes to turn on lights. And by turning on lights, I just mean painting this orange color on top of the windows. And I'm trying to create a pleasing arrangement of lights. I'm thinking about my composition, and then also thinking about storytelling, like who's in this building, what are they doing? Often like you'll have buildings where there'll be sections of lights that are all on, because maybe there's a bunch of people in that part of the building, like all doing something together. And then of course I'm adding in some sky reflections too, which helps bring kind of the color together. It helps the piece feel unified, because we've got some purple in the orange, and then we've got some orange in the purple. Just get some nice color variation throughout it. We're getting to the part of the painting where I'm mostly adding little details, turning on windows here and there, and then shading and lighting using multiply layers, overlay layers, soft light layers, things like that. So I'm going to give you some kind of parting tips to do with the brush set, just things that I've kind of figured out from working with them. Of course, you're totally welcome to use them however you want to. You don't need to use them the way that I do. This is just the way that I figured they would be used. But I know that with the foliage brush set, lots of people used the brushes in ways I never would have figured out that were like so creative and amazing. So definitely experiment. But so yeah, some little tips. So I definitely recommend layering them sometimes. So for example, I'm using some of the square brushes to like layering that on top of the windows that I've already set up and locked. I really like how that looks. I think that that can be a really nice effect. Another way that we can do this actually is you can do that before you transform the windows onto the building. And sometimes that's actually even a little bit better. Especially if you want something to really feel like it's sitting in perspective, then, you can draw the windows, draw the tower of windows flat, then use one of the square brushes, in that flat perspective to make some windows lighter, darker, etc. Create interesting patterns of, kind of square shapes with those square brushes, and then transform them in, and then we won't have squares facing forward on a set of windows that's in perspective, if that makes sense. But here in this more kind of like painterly quick painting, I wasn't super bothered by that. Another tip, which actually kind of corresponds with what you just saw, was mixing and matching them on the same building. I know I mentioned this before, but yeah, taking multiple different types of windows and using them on the same building can look really nice. And if we look at city photography, a lot of buildings actually are built that way. They have different types of windows on them. And then also we can cut away different pieces of the windows, or, cut out columns and pillars, cut out different architectural elements on the window stacks to make them a little bit more original and unique, and feel like they sit in with the buildings a little bit better. That is something that I think really helps them sit in the space and makes them feel more integrated into the environment around them. Something else to pay attention to is the scale of the windows. So for example, if you've got buildings toward the front of the canvas, closer to where the camera would be if we were taking a photo in this scene, if it was real, we want to make sure that those windows feel like they're bigger, that feel like they're closer to us in space than the windows in the back. And sometimes this can, there's different ways that we can do this. It's not always going to be that the windows closest to us are really huge and the windows in the back are, always smaller. For example, if there's a giant convention center in the back that has really, really huge windows, and then a smaller building closer to us that has smaller windows, that can be, you might have to fight with that a little bit to get it to read well, because logically, those convention center windows might really be bigger. But, there's different things that we can do to make them feel like they're still further back in space, like using a set of windows that has a thinner leading, thinner window leading, to where it feels like the glass is huge and that the columns supporting it are much thinner. That will make it feel like it's pushed back in space. Whereas thicker window leading, thicker, more space in between the windows, that will usually make it feel like the building is closer to us, because it implies that, maybe it's a smaller building. And there needs to be, the windows themselves are smaller, and so there's more wall around them, so to speak. So, just paying attention to the scale of things. In order to get buildings in the back to read really massive, sometimes we got to make those windows really, really tiny. And that can really help. The scale can make it feel really grand to have those really, really small windows on those huge towers in the background. That can really add to the sense of majesty and awe in a scene. So paying attention to scale is something that I find really important. Another tip is to pay attention to the structure of the building. So for example, usually on apartment buildings, for example, we don't have windows wrapping around a corner. We do sometimes on some expensive apartment buildings, but say on your more typical older, larger apartment building in LA or New York, most of the time there's going to be concrete on the corners because it's going to be much cheaper for there to be, solid wall on the corners, and then the windows are going to be on the flat walls, if you understand what I mean. Versus, a really expensive modern house might have big windows wrapping around the side, and there's, a corner in the window. Paying attention to, what the structure, where the wall is in comparison to the window, that says different things about the architecture. That says something about the structure that the windows are sitting on. So kind of paying attention to what we want to say with where those walls are. And then also making sure there is some structure. These days it's possible for buildings to be almost entirely window. There are some towering buildings that are all shiny and all window all over. So that's not impossible. But a lot of buildings have, structural concrete hard elements interspersed with the glass, and some big pillars, some support pillars on the outside that maybe at the corners or sometimes in the middle, that are supporting the structure of the building, and also being used as design elements and being used as weight. Like, for example, a building that is just one type of window all over, all the way from floor to ceiling, is, that's making a statement for sure, but it has a little bit less design to it than something that has two or three types of windows and some columns here and some rows here. And, these windows are broken up and these windows are shorter and these are taller. Often buildings will have like two or three unique design elements, not always, but often. So I find that looking for those and figuring out what we want to say with them can be really valuable for giving each building personality and character, thinking about the location as a character in the scene and what we want to say with it. Something else to pay attention to is how buildings meet the ground. Where's the door? Where's the entrance? Are there big windows at the bottom? Is there a different type of window? Often like department stores will be at the bottom of buildings with like big glass windows, or sometimes like other types of stores will be on the first floor, or like big welcoming office, entryway spaces. If you've got like a big company in a towering building, oftentimes they'll have like a lounge area, with where they would like greet people who are coming in on the ground floor, or maybe the first few floors, and often those will have really big, like bigger windows maybe than the rest of it, or long windows to let in a lot of light and, make it feel like a really welcoming, airy space. So, paying attention to how that looks from the outside and how that translates into what sort of design elements you should put on that bottom section of the building. It also really helps kind of divide up buildings, giving the bottom more weight, like a different statement than the rest of it, helps create, sometimes like a 20/80 or 70/30 type of division between, that bottom section of the building and the top section of the building, that can look really nice and give the scene some, extra personality and interest. Well, as we get toward the end here, I'll just point out a few other uses of the brushes. I'm using the square brushes for a lot of stuff here. And then I also threw some railings in a couple places. A lot of you guys probably caught that, but I didn't mention it. But yeah, I threw a couple railings in, just adding little details, added a little crosswalk, just kind of filling out this scene, working from my just working memory of what this type of location might look like, adding little shrubs, adding little lights here and there, final little details. I like doing a lot of that with this square brush in this type of a rough scene. I think that the square brushes add a lot of personality, and it just makes it feel kind of cute and designy, which I like a lot. But yeah, that's about it. I didn't use every type of brush in this. I definitely want to do more demos, so keep an eye out. Those will be coming. I didn't have time to do all of them before the brushes release, but there will be more coming in the future. I want to do more cityscapes. Let me know how using the brushes goes for you. I'm really excited to see all the work that you guys make. Like, I really can't wait. It's the night before they're releasing right now while I'm recording this, and I'm just so excited to see what everyone does. So thank you so much for watching through this this half-hour video, and have fun with the brushes. I'll see you guys next time.